Okay, so I guess, yeah, I'll just go through some of these images which were kindly supplied by Ross Kavanagh, documentation of the exhibition, because I'm aware that not all of you might have made it down there, but also it'll just give us a structure from which to work from in terms of describing how the work came about, I guess. And just to say as well, if anybody feels the need to move around during this or make noise or kind of needs to go out or whatever at any point, please feel welcome to do so. Okay, so I suppose I can come back to what Irla was saying about our working relationship, because that's been like pivotal in terms of the creation of this body of work. As an artist, I had been practicing for about 10 years as a fully able-bodied artist, and when my disability kind of came to a point where my mobility was affected to the extent that I couldn't practice the way that I always had done, I thought I really need to sit down and think about this because, and literally sit down and think about this because I need to know what this means on many levels. I had a really ambivalent relationship to the idea of support. It made me feel quite nervous, this idea of accessing support. I think there was a sense for me whereby I had been making art kind of in quite like what I saw at that time as being quite an autonomous way, but you know, when I really thought about it, I realized that nobody makes art in an autonomous way. And I really wanted to explore where those feelings of reticence were coming from in terms of the idea of using or working with a support worker to make my work. I suppose for me, the studio space is quite an intimate space. The processes whereby you come to actually kind of forming work or formulating work is kind of quite an intimate kind of moment. So I was just kind of very nervous about this idea of having to use a support worker to make work. So at the time I reached out to Irla a few years ago now and said, we decided we might have like a very slow conversation around ideas of access and what slowness means to that, and because everything needed to happen in its own time. And so Irla and I have been having these really wonderful generative conversations without the pressure of actually creating anything essentially out of those conversations. And that was an important part of our approach. And then at a certain point, it became clear that we could potentially move this forward a little bit. And we decided to apply to Arts and Disability Ireland for funding, which would enable me to work with a support worker, to create a body of work which really thinks about this notion of the dynamics of support. Because for me, it really felt kind of pertinent that for me, the notion of support kind of is imbued with a lot of problematics. Especially it's like reflected really beautifully across all of the exhibitions here through the festival. This idea of around I guess there's a lot of like violence inherent to care and institutional support. And so I really wanted to think about that when I was coming to this work. And then for me personally, the idea of working with a support worker brought up questions around working to or along somebody else's timeline when my timeline is very much in kind of crip time. I'm not always able to do the things I want to do on a particular day. And so there was that issue and just this general sense of suspicion around what support meant. This idea that support might in fact involve some kind of questionable sense of benevolence as well. There's a lot of problematics there I really wanted to think about. So here's an image of the install in the gallery, in the TULCA gallery, it's showing a cluster of these sculptures that were made. They consist a lot of poles made from jesmonite. Some of them have draped mosaic panels across them, and some of them are suspended with slings from medical aids and hoists. I'm using a lot of carabiner clips. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce them, but they're clips that you use for on mobility aids and hoists and for climbing as well. And there's some of these referencing gym equipment. So they're kind of fabricated found objects that kind of think about ideas of suspension and support. And they're based on they were very much kind of created in response to this particular space as well. These works kind of were informed by site visits. I was responding to the starkness of this space. The concrete, void kind of spoke to me in terms of it feeling quite stark and maybe potentially unsupportive, if that makes sense. So I had this idea that I wanted to create objects that spoke to a sense of vulnerability, because I was trying to search for this notion of like a crip aesthetic, because I was very much kind of, these are almost in a way, they're kind of like self-portraits in a way, trying to communicate how I feel as somebody who doesn't always feel like physically safe navigating the way that the world is set up. So they do have a sense of fragility to them and vulnerability, and that's really important. These divots in the sculptures are actually made through manipulation during their making. I used a lot of like walking aids and mobility aids to kind of form the bends and support the final shape. So a lot of these, so they're actually referencing grab bars and walking sticks and things like that. But they're also very obviously kind of they're holding that notion of fluidity as well, which was important to me, that they've been through a process, that they show that they've been through a process, if that makes sense. So just to think, so they're made from this, these particular parts are made from jesmonite, which I was able to use in my home. That was important for me. And when Irla and I were discussing this project, it was, and we, I was like feeling quite nervous about the idea of how do you even go about accessing support for something like this. And it was just like, I can't express how important it was for me to be able to have Irla by my side and informing that conversation in the safest, slowest possible way, because it made it accessible. Like, that's what access is, I think, in a way, is that knowing you can actually throw something out there, and even if you don't know the answer, that there's always a solution, and it's a conversation essentially. So she came up with the notion that we would put an open call out as part of the TULCA project, and funded through ADI for an artist support worker. And amazing people applied for this role. And we decided to go with Sandra McAllister, who is an artist in her own right, but just had this, it was just such a wonderful experience, actually, to invite Sandra into my home to make these works with her. And just to be able to discuss it with her on a day-to-day basis, and have enough time as well to be able to kind of figure each other out as well. It was a very natural feeling kind of process, which I'm still kind of like really grateful for and in awe of, the fact that things were that kind of just organic. It felt quite organic. but also very carefully sort of planned as well, which is really important. The other thing I just wanted to talk about, I guess I was thinking in this space, I mentioned before that there was this notion of like the space informing the work, and the jesmonite itself is often used as a decorative medium just for creating like architectural features and things. So I wanted to kind of like take this kind of image of the gallery space and think about it in a broader context as in the art industry. So the gallery space, it's quite stark and bare, and there's not a lot of comfort in there really, although that space is amazing. It's very warm in there, which was really good to have the heating and everything. But generally, my experience of the art industry has been that it is quite a hostile environment to misfit bodies, and I really wanted to talk about that through this work. So although everything might seem okay from the outside, it does actually, there is an inherent danger of violence to it in the way that it's structured. It doesn't always speak to our bodies as vulnerable as they are. You can get hurt, which is like it might sound quite dramatic, but it is possible to overwork. There's a lot of burnout that exists within the arts. And I really wanted to kind of reference that with these works. So although they're sort of suspended and hanging and quite precarious, there's like there's not much space between them and the floor. And that was important for me to really think about the fact that you're so close to the floor, but there could be, these objects, they're very prone to breakage, and they could, easily, be destroyed. And I really wanted to think about that. And these mosaicked structures that are balanced within and around the objects as well. I was thinking about this notion of like the decorative and aspects of our architectural environments, that if you thought about them being almost like just pulled up like a skin and then upended, and then just hung over some other structure. So it's like kind of trying to kind of communicate this sense of the world being sort of turned upside down, as somebody who is likely to fall quite a lot. I really wanted to kind of think about that through these objects as well. And the colour scheme as well is very much based upon the scheme of the gallery as well, and thinking about fleshy tones. As a white person, I can only reference my own experiences, and I just kind of wanted to give that sense of kind of like that these are almost like self-portraits in a way. So just to give you another, I just wanted to also talk about this idea of kind of like working into injury, this notion of what I was trying to find out about was this kind of like, okay, so I want to write about my injury or talk about my injury and make work about my injury, and that how a crip aesthetic might be located therefore in showing your vulnerability. And that's also a big part of where these works were coming from, is that in order to actually access support, you actually have to talk about your vulnerability, or you have to show yourself as vulnerable, which is something that I really, really struggled with and still do as my inherent like internal ableism is always and ever present. So that's something I really wanted to talk about with these works as well. The other thing I wanted to say is that I wanted them to feel like, to make the viewer feel as though we all affect each other. So I was aware that, walking into this space, that I wanted to speak to the viewer about the notion that their body and how they move and navigate through that space kind of like can affect and just to allow people maybe a way into maybe just thinking about that or sensing that within themselves somehow, because these are so fragile that they could easily it wouldn't take much to kind of knock them over, I guess. And I also wanted to, I suppose, one of the people I look to quite a lot in thinking about a lot of these things is this writer and academic, Julietta Singh. And I'm just going to use a couple of quotes from her. She's written a book called No Archive Will Restore You, who I'm not sure if you're aware of her, but she's talking about the body as an archive and how it's just not a reliable archive, but that it does store experiences, and how we can learn things. We can learn through our bodies, and that it is like almost like a repository of experience, and that's really valuable, but that it's not reliable. And so she says, there is an archival crisis already looming here, because the body's surface is ultimately not stable ground upon which to build an archive. While the skin is a visual sign of the body's exterior limit, she's referencing the physicist Karen Barad, emphasises how, in fact, bodies extend into the space well beyond the skin. And with these objects, I really wanted them to stick out and protrude into a space in a way that was like both almost like ethereal and also quite like you can't deny that they're there, you know. So although they're delicate, they're quite stubborn, and so I guess, and then her point, I suppose, through that, thinking about that, is like that we're not bounded, contained subjects, but ones that are filled up with foreign feelings and vibes that linger and circulate in space, that enter us as we move through our lives. So we all collect information as we move through our lives, either physical or emotional or whatever it is, and that we carry that. And that, I guess she's asking for us to be aware of that, I guess. And for me, at the moment, that's my understanding of access. And like, I guess I try to adopt that when I'm thinking about what access can be, because it's such a complex thing. What one person's access might be, it will in kind of interfere with another's. So I'm just like really interested in that dynamic. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I might read a little now from the text that I wrote. And this is like not a finished body of work by any means. This text is in evolution, but it's sort of like a record or documentation of the process of actually making these objects, and my thoughts around that, and it also gives you a sense of the fact that this work wasn't made in a professional studio. It was made in my home, and for me that's important, because that's what my access needs. That's part of my access needs, and I guess the other thing I'd say about it is that I'm playing with the notion of how to bring the I in this text. So I always struggle with this idea of writing about my experiences, and how do you bring like I. So as a way to sort of negate that, I kind of created an external character, an external narrative voice, who was addressing me in this text, and then I play with that at the very end. So just in case it's confusing for any of you, but we can have a chance to talk about that afterwards as well. And it'll take about 15 minutes to read this. Does that sound okay to you guys? As I said, if anyone needs to move around or anything, please do. Hoist, Act 1. You had the notion of creating mobiles, but in your body you kept reverting to the sensation of a hoist. Your compulsion was to conflate the two in their respective acts of balance. The former which denotes something capable of movement, not stationary. The latter speaks to being raised, elevated and fixed via a strap or a clip. It is this detail which feels significant, the urge to make visible the sense of being suspended, movable yet tethered, the sense of being acted upon. Considering the equilibrium between vulnerability and its relationship to resistance, Judith Butler writes that the very term mobilization depends on an operative sense of mobility, itself a right, one which many people cannot take for granted. She argues that we do not all have the supports in place through which to demonstrate our vulnerabilities freely. For example, to march against cuts to services or for women and trans people to use our streets safely. As a support worker, you used medical hoists to aid a person's movement from one place to another, perhaps from a chair to a bed. It always struck you that in the supposed safety of this act, there was a sense of innate danger, even when one was so close to the floor. As a disabled person, you automatically assess your physical surroundings for possible hazards. The steel frame of the apparatus moved slowly, but as its casters hit the edge of an electrical cable or the sole of a slipper, it caused the sling, which was attached to its hoist, to swing slightly over and back. Perhaps it was the posture in which the sling held the body that emanated the precariousness of its suspension. The body, already so close to the ground, is cradled in a fetal position and is in this instance dependent upon others to ensure it remains unharmed. The sling can also be understood as a device from which to launch something, to upend something. You had the notion of casting limbs. Yes, you would then call them limbs, because for one thing they posit a gesture. What you mean is that they speak to vulnerability, a vulnerability to be rehearsed or enacted against the hostile architecture of the gallery. You had the notion of creating suspended limbs which may not survive, may need to be bound and rebound together. They were to be poured into the world, and you would observe how they would behave, unwieldy and fallible, awkward, protesting, sticking out. They were prone to breakage, and when this happened, sometimes you would create a ligature, binding them together, somewhat clumsily. In the workshop, which is your garden shed, you prepare the moulds, long, thin and tubular. You mix the materials and watch as your work bleeds and drains in all directions, sets too quickly or not quickly enough. You attempt to fasten the pieces to the steel frame supporting the roof, but you do not have the mobility or enough limbs of your own to achieve the desired outcome. You persevere. You are adamant that this gesture be made visible against the backdrop of the gallery. Judith Butler writes, "No one moves without a supportive environment and set of technologies. If it is necessary to expose our vulnerabilities to the world so that we might demonstrate how our bodies are being acted upon, it strikes you that sometimes the word support is used to shore up a paternalistic drive to provide stability in exchange for compliance with heteronormative capitalist values. Giving and receiving support, like art making, is an act of trial and error." Prop, Act 2. A prop is an object used in a play to stand in for something. In this play, you needed to be propped up, but you didn't know how to ask for that. On the arrival of S, your support worker, you observe the physical putting together of your bodies once unknown to each other. You consider the shape of your respective bodies and how they work in tandem. Do not read aloud. Not knowing how to communicate a needs creates a silence, and this work silently gestures towards what it is that I need. I cannot imagine what it would feel like to not spend the working day accented by the possibility of falling and by various shades of pain which build to a crescendo by early evening. Must we show ourselves as vulnerable? You are not sure how much of this you should reveal to S. Porosity. On the one hand, it is necessary to be porous, to allow people in to help. On the other, in the instance of the sculpture, porosity weakens it. It may shift, crumble, seep, merge to become something else. It may refuse to survive. When S arrives, you are nervous. I say to you, think of support as a narrative, a storytelling strategy, an assistive device, as it were, for when you don't have the words or can't locate them. I remind you that all narrative is plastic, mutable, movable. I see you. You have never felt so averse to your work, yet you cover all of the bases, the stools to reduce time standing, stooping, to alleviate pain, the makeshift tables occupying every room in your home, the crutches, sticks and props you use to make your way around. Yet, here you are now, flying from your work like a hand from an open flame. Your fight or flight response is in full bloom. You use the open window of the workshop, a portal onto the garden, to breathe yourself into some other perspective. Your home is a shifting series of workshops and designated areas of production. These extend from your bed to your sitting room at the front of the house with a big window which saturates everything in light. The sofa has been removed in favour of a work table with a view of the mountain and the horse chestnut tree your grandmother planted. Through the front hallway, where a collection of amorphous delivery boxes and saved wrapping materials cling to each other, underneath the stairs and into your kitchen, in which the floor space is inhabited by sculptures curing, propped up or pinned down by various ad hoc means, a walking stick borrowed for a day, masking tape smeared to the tiles underneath to keep everything in position. There are sketches with measurements and scribbled attempts at visualization in piles on the kitchen table, keeping company with shopping lists and children's drawings to be placed to one side whilst you eat. Through the back door to the outside tap, an old rusted garden furniture set and a broken clothes horse used as a support from which to carry out sanding, polishing, spraying and sealing. Upstairs on the landing, you make the longest limbs because this is the most expansive, cleanest stretch of space you have in which to cast. S bears the brunt of the physicality of the pour as you steady the mould from a stool underneath. You are all collective arms and legs as you work mostly in silence, save for a bump or a nod or a sound or a motion towards aiding the digestion of the fluid down into its tubular length, much like an intestine extended along the floorboards. The liquid requires guidance and encouragement. As you cast the work, it burps and squelches in a scatological soundscape. S watches for airlocks and tends to these, while you hold the mouth open. Inside the sliding door of the garden shed, there are 2 large plastic tubs gleaned from the local farm supply shop, one yellow, one black. They are filled with water and set upon a bench for ease of reach, a dirty one and a less dirty one for dunking fresh resin from mixing buckets and tools. The water is changed regularly by S, who strains the silt so as not to block the drains in your home. S is mindful of such things. S is sensitive in her movements so as not to stand back or move too quickly. She can hold her body impressively in a variety of stances to save herself knocking off of something fragile in the compromised space around you both. She operates in a manner so that you don't have to explain things at length. After your first day with S, you notice that the considerable pain, usually impossible to ignore, like a drunkard arriving home from a night out and waking the neighbours, has not yet made its presence known. In the workshop, the tubs of water hold the cold absorbed in the first frost of the season, the kind of cold that would skin you, as your mother would have put it. You work to prevent your foot from getting below a certain temperature because it's difficult to come back from that, and anyway, the required processes are tedious. Your foot shuns energy like the moon reflects light. The pain is akin to that fat ache you associate with having your extremities plunged for too long into a bucket of ice. Outside the workshop, a crow uses the hard edge of a concrete pier to break the shell of a snail, releasing the delicious meat inside. Sling, Act 3. On the landing of my home, I consider the shape of my body propped on a stool and the shape of S's body as we stoop in a synchronized style to transfer the longest of the limbs to a safer place. The negative space between the floor and the object is charged with the knowledge that its survival is dependent upon our bodies working collectively. To work independent of one another would secure the demise of the sculpture. A movement not negotiated will increase its liability to snap. We underpin that what the other is doing, sliding our fingers at strategic points under its surface as we perform the lift and transfer. We allow the limb to slide onto its desired fulcrum loosely in our palms, then lay it to rest upon a pillow stolen from my bed. The artwork is an entity to be cared for and respected in all of its inconvenience and unreasonable requirements. People said, "Are you sure you should be doing this?" To which I replied, "This time it's different." I continue to make excuses for the work, which aggravates my injury even as it stares back, unblinkingly, somewhat callously, in my direction. The work does not care for me in the way that I must care for it. The value of our labour in this exchange is at odds with the value of the artwork itself. Yet there is something integral to this fact, which I am compelled to lean towards. You had the notion of creating suspended limbs which may not survive, may need to be bound and rebound together. The ligature in language, such as AE in English and French, reflects how support functions. It is an entity crossed with and joined to another entity to create a new character, a shift of form from one thing to another, an assimilation, a push together. Limbs float out stubbornly, flaunting their fragility against the gallery setting, begging the question, what will happen if they touch us or if we brush off of them? We negotiate the world in our bodies, alert to our collective potential. Against the backdrop of the gallery, we are heightened to the effect our presence enacts upon the other, that which we orbit with such care in this particular context, with such critical awareness. You try not to feel cynical about this. In the workshop, you glance outwards through the sliding doors and focus your gaze on the horse chestnut tree your grandmother planted almost a century ago. You visualize yourself in its branches, safe from imaginary predators, conjuring the perception of a child resting in the crook of its limb. For the psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, the earliest sensations of being held are integral to our ability later in life to hold ourselves together after a trauma. Your pain is loud today, so you shift your attention to consider how our evolutionary past is always present within us, your pain response closely linked to the automatic nervous system, which remains the same as it was when we needed to escape the advances of a saber-toothed tiger. You observe that the tree is flowering, architectural pink and white blossoms. What is it called when a plant is cut back too much, or gets a harsh winter and the result is that it yields more growth? You think of this often, recall thinking about it with other artists. A friend reports that it wasn't the right conditions or support that grew them into an artist. It was a lack of nurture that compelled them to find others to grow them. Is that not true of flowering plants? Immobile as they are, they rely upon others to survive. When you arrive at the gallery to install the work, you place the limb inside its sling horizontally, about a metre from the ground. It floats there. You are standing close by, your attention turned to another, and perhaps there is a change of pressure in the air or someone breathes outwards, and it slides silently forwards upon its own weight and down, hitting the floor below, transformed into tiny fractured pieces. You imagine lying next to it on the concrete, safe in the knowledge of what falling apart feels like. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bridget. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. I forgot to mention our audio descriptions. So I'm a white woman with long curly brown hair, looking slightly more disheveled than usual today. And we were in a large, well, medium-sized cinema room with red curtains and a projection of some sculptures on the screen. Would you like to give your...
Yeah, thank you. I'm a white woman with blonde hair and clear framed glasses, sitting next to Irla in this room.
Thank you very much. First of all, I wanted to say how beautiful those texts are. I didn't get a full chance to read them before they were posted, and I remember reading it throughout the festival, and it all coming together, and really realizing the poetics of the work. So we're going to have a short Q&A, a conversation between the two of us, and then we'll open it up to the audience. But if anyone wants to interrupt us or ask questions or something wasn't clear, please do that. I was scribbling down questions throughout our conversation because so much came to mind. So I suppose the first one is that it's how the work was made. So you discussed quite a lot about the process of hiring a support worker and what that was like. And I suppose, could you talk about, it took us, thinking about maybe a year to fundraise and then think about how you wanted to work with a support worker and the job description. And it was very formal. We did interviews and we had assessment sheets and we got insurance, and it felt very serious. But then I was wondering, and we found, I think, the most perfect person ever in Sandra. And I was wondering what was the actual day-to-day experience of working with a support worker like?
I struggled, I have to say, because there is a sense of the fact that, I guess when you're on your own time, you can sort of check in and check out. Now, Sandra being the most unbelievably, she's just so good at access. She has such a big broad understanding of what's needed. Couldn't have made it easier for me, but I still struggled. There were days when I kind of felt like I'm not really sure how much more we can do today, but at the same time, that this person has put aside a working day to be there, so you need to make that work, It's not just about how you decide to use your time. You have to obviously be really mindful and careful about this other person who's given of themselves for this particular project. So for me, that was something that I need to probably become more accustomed to and feel more comfortable with. I'm also not used to directing somebody in that context. I acquired my injuries whilst I was doing too much work in terms of my practice, and then working to pay my rent and do all these other things. That's always in the back of my mind. Okay, so I've been somebody who's just worked to the point of literally harming my body mortally, kind of ending up in an emergency surgery situation. So I'm really kind of like, that's also been a big part of why our conversation, like being so slow, has been really important, and feeling like it's okay. There's a lot of the conversations that happen, I think, within the art industry are around what's next, and okay, so now you've done this, so what else are you going to do? What's the next thing? And it was so kind of like healing and kind of reassuring to know that we were actively resisting that, what's next. And see what comes out of that, And we were also supported through Field Arts, which is an organisation, it's a pilot scheme, right?
I think it's still a pilot. It's an organisation supported by the Arts Council. It has a very technical name. It's a creative production support agency, which is not exactly very poetic. I'm a producer on retainer for them, an independent producer, and I produce the work of Bridget and Eben. And they basically allow me to do what I like for a retainer year, and then basically I'm like your exclusive producer. But I must say that it is a support agency, so that has enabled me to work independently as a curator because the fees aren't amazing, but also to think in a more slow fashion and to work with you in a way that, like, okay, we don't need to apply for a project grant and produce an exhibition in the next 6 months. We can take 2 years, apply for research money, apply for like reflection money. Also, there's supports from Field Arts itself. So there was an environment where that was possible, which I felt very,
Yeah, it was made very clear by the organisation that they really wanted to invest in that slowness, because I think from the outset that was the terminal, that was the major umbrella heading, was slowness, and I suppose for me that was the access, because I really wasn't sure if I wanted to even be an artist anymore. There was a point at which I was thinking, I do not want to engage in this anymore. And so that was a really interesting kind of situation to be involved in. But also when I know there is, like, on the other hand, you were saying there was like lots of, like, it was very serious, this process of employing the support worker, but there was a great safety in that also, because everybody knew what was at stake, because often in the arts there's these like unwritten contracts around what's expected of you, and you just kind of push forward and go beyond to kind of make the best job of everything. And I really appreciated that about the process that you instigated, Deirdre. It's like everybody knows what's expected of them, and we're not going to ask anybody to do anything that's beyond their kind of capacity or remit. And I know that Sandra won't mind me saying, but one of the things that really clinched it for me when we spoke to her in the interview was that she had just been kind of received a diagnosis as a neurodiverse person, and you could see that this was all like a very new kind of realization for her. But the fact that she made herself kind of exposed herself in that way to talk about her own experiences of disability, for me was like, I can trust. I felt like there was such a great level of trust extended there, and I really appreciated that, and that helped me a great deal then to kind of know that she was kind of certainly the best person for the job.
Yeah, I think you spoke about it beautifully. There were a lot of the works in the festival are not really about disability, but made through disability from a CRIP perspective, and you can really see that in the work. About it's like it is not explicit in many ways.
Yeah.
It is a process-based work. It emerged through accessibility and collaboration, and also 3 disabled people, a support worker, an artist, and a producer, working together, and thinking about how that manifests work. But we've talked about this a lot, self-portraits, and we had nicknames for them, which we will not repeat, because they were very confidential nicknames. But they did reveal kind of the vulnerability of showing self-portraits in a way, like the fragility of them. You talk about as a white person and the tones of them, of the way they take up space. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about them being self-portraits and the vulnerability of showing self-portraits in a space such as this.
Yeah, I mean, like, I guess it's really important to me when, like, because I can only speak to my own experience of, like, navigating the world, and you know, I suppose that's essentially what these are about. You know, they're trying to evoke or communicate a certain stance or experience of being in the world and of accessing support, which was sometimes very institutional and quite a traumatic experience. I've had quite traumatic experiences of accessing support through institutions and other avenues, I guess, and of course the festival itself is talking about, like, the West as this kind of, like, place with this history of a lot of that and more, which I'm not describing it well now, but I suppose in terms of self-portraiture, you know, when I was mentioning in the text there, you know, I really got a lot from what Judith Butler wrote around feeling vulnerable and how to, because I was like, in the beginning, how do I show this? How do I continue as an artist when I don't fit this image anymore, I can't enter into that space or into that conversation in the way that I had learned to, and which was incredibly problematic in the first place. But also, I not comfortable necessarily showing my vulnerability or talking about what's going on. But in a way, that's the only way that you can actually, you need to show your vulnerability. For me, that's what I had come to, that realization that you know, it was necessary to show a level of vulnerability in order to demonstrate that things aren't right somehow, if that makes sense, and that potentially maybe could we have a conversation about this.